Can you hear the bell? Yeah. Okay.
So mostly these countries are hotspots for companies to come and invest in because of the resources that they have. Then lastly, we see that the economy in most instances largely depends on the selling, exploration, and utilization of those resources for the benefit of not just their citizens, but also members of the global community. See how largely the GDP of Nigeria relies on things like exploration of oil and gas, and also countries like South Africa also rely on large exploration of things like fossil oil and all those things. So basically, in terms of economic growth, they are most likely dependent on the utilities of most of their natural resources. What is the problem with government retention, and why do we think that resource rent can actually resolve this problem? I think that largely, when it comes to the natural resources that are embedded in most of these countries, it comes with the plague of large inequalities among its citizens. And why is this true? This is largely true because the influx of capitalism and the activities of companies strategically turns most of these countries into classist societies that only benefit those who have fewer cash to actually enjoy the benefit that comes with massive investments that it is in these countries, at the plague of average citizens who do not have the financial capacity to do so. Secondly, we also think that the problem also that comes with most of these resource-rich countries that we think comes with government retention is also the existence of problems when it comes to redistribution of wealth to the point where it gets to be enjoyed by average citizens in the society. This redistribution comes with issues of one, government prioritizing public individuals who are major investors in terms of states who are major investors and neglecting certain parts of their society, cutting for underdevelopment of certain regions. Secondly, it could also become things like tribal affiliations for societies who are extremely rigid in that to prioritize individuals that they feel can actually give them utility because of those affiliations. And then lastly, in terms of political will, regions who have more political will to do things like giving them more voter power, etc., are often more prioritized. So basically, these societies with large resources also have issues in terms of redistribution of wealth, because in terms of the revenue they make from these resources, now integrating into other principles that are problematic with the society that affects the average citizen and their primary existence. What do we think resource rent looks like, and what's the policy? We think that in terms of resource rent, we think that government has the capacity to do so, and we don't think capacity should be a problem. Why? Government works on federal systems and algorithms that collect data from majorly every single citizen in their society. So even if the policy is going to be that we're going to give everybody in the society this financial resource in terms of the revenue we collect from these companies, we think that government has the capacity to do so because of the minerals that we collect from this large algorithm. And secondly, we could also do it in a world where we prioritize giving back those particular resource rents to probably the regions where these resources come from and prioritize those things. That's also what we start to score by collecting the data of this particular individual and ensuring that the resources coming from their lands that most of these companies are utilizing, they get the necessary reimbursement. Yeah,
just to be clear, your problem currently is that the redistribution of all those backwards, they give it to places, they vote for them. But in this paradigm, you are going to pay people who are in coastal areas whose beaches they are using for tourism, which means if you're in a place where resources aren't abundant, you are crucially instructing leaving them out.
But I just gave 2 ways this policy can work. In a world where everybody gets distribution because government has the ability to get that to do so with children. Secondly, if you want to prioritize people that come from those regions, I don't understand what that is talking about. Moving forward, panel, I think primarily, why do we need to prove 2 things from OG? Why is this necessary and why is it justified? 2 argumentations. And also, lastly, on the policy, within that in terms of how the resources will be measured, most of these companies come into these countries and they're giving lands and quotas. So basically, the level of profit you make out of the resources extract from that land and quota will be measured in terms of the revenue, and we give like probably 25% back to people, 30%, depending on what the country wants to use in terms of generating the quota, as to measure the level of revenue those companies make to the point where they get the cash to give back to people. Looking at primarily, why is this policy necessary and why is it justified? In terms of justification, primarily, right, we think that primarily the governments of today's societies, major democratic societies that have major rich resources, have failed to primarily provide for the basic needs of their citizens who own most of the lands and resources primarily based on their ancestry, and have failed to impact their domestic lives, and have failed to impact them and benefited capitalists, foreign corporations, etc., which cause lots of antagonism and dissatisfaction on the primary populace. On those particular grounds, we think it's primarily justified for government to redress this primary injustice that's done on these people by ensuring that the resources of itself are taxed in terms of rentage, and the revenues that these companies are benefiting of the resources of the people are giving back to those particular individuals in a way that they can financially cater for themselves and utilize it. We think that these resources in of itself are gained for the people and belong to them in a particular area. So government in of itself has that legitimate justification to do this because they have neglected to do their primary responsibility for the longest of time. Why is this primarily necessary after the justification? We think that the necessity here is on 2 things. Primarily, when we do resource strength, then firstly, resource strength are important in terms of like bridging that into inequality and also ensuring for the development within those local regions. And why do we think that this is true? The first one in terms of impacting local individuals when this resource and when the cash is going to them, why that's primarily important. Most average persons can't afford the basic standard of living that exists in the capitalist society that government sets up on them because of the necessary attraction that comes from most of these resources. We didn't know when this cash are restricted to those particular individuals that actually invest to build themselves, their local businesses, and also their local communities to provide the necessary infrastructure that they lack. You know, also in terms of reduction of things like capital flight that comes to things like government retention, most of the resources in terms of revenue that government gets in most of these corporations or in terms of taxation are not properly regulated to the point that people understand what the money is used for and how it inherently affects their family life. This is more like a direct impact that actually creates more probability mechanism for individuals to hold government accountable and ask much better regions on how primarily this affects their existence. And then secondly, on how this is primarily necessary. We think that the resource strength provides a more proper regulatory system because it directly impacts its people and not actually creating room for middlemen behind sign engagement and behind sign business that contract that people do not actually know the component of what it entails. This is primarily important because this regulation of itself creates a direct negative positive harm on individuals in the society by giving them the repeated access to revenue that comes from the resources that actually belong to most of their demographics. Why is this primarily important? Primarily, I've told you what the problems that exist in the society that comes from the fact that inevitably they have resources that are mismanaged and not properly redistributed by government, and why this cash that comes from the resource management is primarily going to bring this gap, and why it is essential for individuals, and why it is justified. Very happy to see you.
Alright, thank you very much for that speech. The House now recognizes the unit position to begin the updates. Yeah, here.
I'm coming. I'm coming. start my speech in a very soon one. What is today's debate about? It's about making a decision about the money that the state is gaining by virtue of its geographical position in the world, and what that choice would mean for the citizens that exist within these places. For the debate to be fair and for the debate to go well, right, we must understand that the comparative instead of distributing cash payments, the comparative is that the state is retaining the amount. So the debate should not necessarily be about MNCs and the activities of these private corporations when the motion itself tells us that these people are retaining these amounts, right? I'm going to prove to you in my speech why the state retaining that amount is significantly better, principally for the people that exist now and for the people that will exist in the state in times to come, and also why that distributing that cash payment is going to be significantly worse for things like and probably things like inequality and the much greater harms that's going to exist in God's will, right? We must understand what countries that are usually resource rich. Usually resource rich countries are probably usually like developing states like Venezuela or Nigeria or even Ghana, where their economy is largely dependent on one source. The reason why this is particularly important is because we are distributing the cash payments, or the state is going to retain that choice is going to be made based on the revenue and based on the premise that these states usually and significantly get their money from the distribution of that only resource. But the other thing, and the reason why that exists, and the reason why having this debate is because they also don't have the capacity to invest in other sectors. So it means other sectors of the economy are not significantly bringing them a lot of return, which means that a lot of the decisions that they are making about this financial decision that's going to be made is going to be made on how this resource is used and how this resource is rent. It's probably going to bring the people a much more proximate benefit, right? The first thing I'm going to talk about is why it's not necessarily going to alleviate the people from the poverty or the places or the situations that these guys see is a harm to the people, right? We think that this is resource rent in the way that they explain it is significantly different from doing things like giving a whole economic opportunities like employment, etc. Because at the point where you are putting money in people's accounts for work that did not necessarily do, it means that you are probably giving them the incentive, you are giving them the signal that they have the discretion to spend that amount of money in a way that they want. Why is that not going to alleviate the people's position? Because one, let's take them on their two fronts that they see. If one, we're going to distribute it to the people nationally, it means that the amount that you are going to get is less likely going to reduce. Because for most of these countries, the amount of proceeds that they are significantly getting over time is not so much, because they don't have the capacity to totally or 100% take the proceeds from this investment. It means that the amounts that they are getting is not enough to necessarily raise their standard of living in that particular regard. But two, if it's probably going to be in the regions that are most probably going to benefit from it, it means the standard of living in those places is going to significantly increase to a point where people in other places that fly to these places are probably going to find it difficult. People who fly to these places for other economic opportunities are going to find it difficult to get things like accommodation and security and have better like etc. Because the standard of life of in these places where this money is being distributed is significantly increased. But why is it principally harmful, and why is it principally unjustified from what regardless of what some of the benefits that's entailed? We think that the government owes a responsibility to the people generally, which generally to provide some level of infrastructure development, etc., and bring the economy some level of state return. It also means that the government also has a responsibility to protect the people when there are things like inflation and global crisis, etc. Why this is important and what the comparative basis on their word. At the point where I'm showing that most of the resources that they are getting are probably going to be getting from a single resource, it means that the government needs that money. Why? Because they lack the capacity to invest in other resources, but two, they also lack the capacity to necessarily find some level of alternative that's going to bring some level of infrastructure development elsewhere. So then it means that if you're going to share the cash payments or you're going to distribute cash payments, the amount of money that the government has to do things that the government is actually mandated to do, like make our roads and make our hospitals in better, etc., and significantly reduce costs, significantly reduce the proceeds that they are getting. If you are significantly reducing the proceeds that they are getting from things like gold and bauxite, etc., it means that things like socialist policies like national health insurance schemes, etc., that help the marginalized are going to significantly reduce their returns from that. What's the comparative on the world and why do you think it's better and why it's not actually not going to work? At the point you are putting money in people's hands, it's less likely they're going to actually use that money to do the things that are most proximate to them. Why? Because the a rational person is short-termist in the way that they spend money. At the point I have money constantly coming to my account, simply because of work I did not do, the likelihood that I'm going to invest to things that are actually important to me, like healthcare, like education, it significantly reduces, because at the end of the day, I'm probably going to think about the fact that, oh, some is going to come next month, and so if an expense comes next month, I'm going to protect myself from it. It means that the average individual who averagely goes to things like health crisis, etc., does not necessarily have the capacity to help themselves in that particular regard, because children have their whole lives dependent on how their dad spends their money. If their dad is using their money to gamble, etc., they can't necessarily, the government can't necessarily stretch their hands to help them because they are using that money for cash payments in the alternative. But why is it also bad when things like crisis and things like that happen? At the point where you've already seen things like global pandemic and wars, etc., shock the economy in the way that it works, it means that the government needs a buffer for some of these problems that exist. The only way that they can get that buffer to probably help them and shield themselves from these things is from that foreign exchange and that resource strength. Because that resource strength usually goes directly to their reserves, which helps them buffer against things like inflationary shocks, etc. At the point where you are going to use that money and you are going to distribute that money as cash payments, you are less likely going to have a buffer against these inflationary shocks. The people are actually the ones who are going to protest when you don't do that in that regard, and it makes the state put the state in a bad place to actually keep the people from happening. Right? And at the end of the day, our last case is on environmental harm and why that is bad. At the point where most of those cash payments, like you are saying, that's a significant amount of money that they are constantly getting every month or every quarter or whatnot, is coming from the environment and its exploitation. It means that could come a time where that amount of money the people are getting has significant, is not enough to meet their standard of living. So they probably want bigger percentages of that resource rent, etc. At the point where too, there's so many, the population is probably going to increase, and so the people that you have to give cash payments to are going to be more. It means that the government is going to be incentivized to continue to do further actions that are going to exacerbate the environmental harm that exists from extracting these resources. Why that is bad and why that is comparatively better? Because at least in our world, there's some level of environmental regulation that the government is mandated to do, because the government, when they are doing things like extracting resources, even if the government is not following those environmental regulations, there are NGOs, international oversight bodies that will come against them when they're doing things like felling trees and for the sake of extracting resources, etc. It's only in the world where you get some level of pushback against these things and make the states better. At the end of the day, you put the states in a better position to actually do their job instead of giving it to money to people that might not necessarily spend it the first way, that's going to spend the first day. Proudly,
Thank you very much for that. And I will now recognize the Prime Minister to further open the area.
So two important things. The first one, OO says that this money is so insignificant, it can't alleviate the poverty of the people, but somehow he thinks that money is so significant, the government can want to build roads and hospitals and give you national insurance scheme and give you all of the beautiful stuff they're talking about. Secondly, he assumes that there's no taxation system in these particular countries that are resource rich. You still pay income tax. All companies still pay corporate tax. Literally every entity that engages in those economies pays taxes. This runs into billions of dollars in literally most countries. Like Ghana has reported huge billions of dollars that they have made recently, about $20 billion and all of that. And the country, the 8th largest economy. If this happens, it's not because of resource rent, etc. But secondly, they are assuming that resource rent is 100% government revenue. That's a drop in the fucking ocean. It doesn't even make up like 24% of most government total revenue when it comes to both external and internal revenues. When you box them up, it's just a little drop in the ocean. This cannot significantly impact on anything that they're talking about. But secondly, governments in most resource-rich countries fund literally every project with fucking loans from IMF, fucking loans from World Bank. That's why Nigeria has almost took loans of about $71 billion. Just because this resource exists doesn't mean that the rent alone is what really matters to the government. Corporate taxes that they get from these particular things and retaining of certain particular amount of cash that you must get. Like, I don't really think that argument really works. And note, it may be a drop in the ocean for the government, but it is fucking big for that poor guy who has been unemployed for 5 good years, doesn't have any parents to rely on, can't drink water because he's in Niger Delta State. There's so much oil spillage in his village, and he has to buy or import water. If that person can get even $1,000, that's a big elevation for that particular person. I don't think anybody is so irrational. You have been unemployed for 5 years. Government is bringing this policy, and all of a sudden you're going to be reckless. You just take the money and go and drink alcohol, or you just waste it. Look, if you are wasting it, that is double jeopardy for you, because government, number one, government does not give quick responses to all of the harm that all these companies actually really perpetuate in these regions. So, for example, when there's oil spillage pollution, when regulators come to punish them, they bribe them instead. So if I give you $2 million instead of going to court to pay $10 million, it's worth it. It's always cheap for them to actually really bypass the laws. And note, they do it because politicians care more about money. They care more about making more resources to go to fight in the next subsequent elections and win. These are things that's actually okay. But even at best case scenario, if you send them to court, they're going to drive you with some of the best lawyers in the world. They're only going to have a 10-year, 15-year rate. That response rate is stupid. Ours is quite quick because you are giving the money to the person to access quality water. Even if it's just quality water, that is a significant delta to OG. These guys don't show you how they solve that. They assume that governments can respond at all times. Government cannot be in every vicinity at all times. That is a significant delta that is missing in CEO and OG. I said gives people the ability to make the response themselves and saves government from trying to respond to everything when they cannot really respond to all dangers and harms that occurs in this particular area. Why is Grace winning this debate over OO? First thing, OO does not respond to the idea of huge inequalities that occur. And that occurs in 3 ways. One, because there's massive gentrification anytime there's a new discovery of oil or, for example, resources. For example, you go to Adam, McBride has a fucking source mining company there. All the locals cannot mine within those concessions. They are cut off. This is the only most significant resource they actually really have. They don't have anything else. They are cut off, which means all the big people or the companies that's coming to mine these oil companies begin to build up huge estates for their own employees. They put in huge roads to help people now find that place more attractive because there is more money incoming in there. You're likely going to meet your future potential business partner and stuff like that in there. When these movements occur, all these citizens are unable to compete in terms of purchasing power. So the watches you were buying for 1 cedis is probably now 20 cedis or 40 cedis. All of them, the first used to pay, a lot of services becomes highly super expensive by virtue of the influx of all of these high class people. Which means you are wrecked more on the down when it comes to equality, for example, access to water, access to your own resources, access to quality life and stuff like that. These guys, on this guy's side, they are fucked up. On that side, you give them a good reason to go to pay, for example. Maybe 5 cities. When you couldn't afford it, we are not putting it into your pocket, you cannot afford that. At least it's a marginal way to let you be able to access those particular same resources and be able to live there. On this guy's side, you are likely going to leave that place because you can't survive there.
Yeah, so just to be clear, our problem with the debate is this. Private companies normally are the ones that extract the resources, take their cuts and give government money and then they pay. I think of regardless of which side you're in the debate, private companies will start, unless there's a nationalized government money.
They'll do what?
Out of order.
Like, his PY is so unclear. But if it means that private companies are still going to extract and move anyways, that happens. That's why government also have regulations. Like, that's why they pay corporate tax. Corporate tax is meant for that because you tax the person in anticipation if there's a problem, right? But the rent that you take, you say give it back to the citizens. Like, I don't really get where his PY is driving. The second reason why Grace will so on inequality, all of the numbers I give to you apply to all persons. And note, poverty rates actually become much more higher than it is. So lastly, this impacts where there's no access to basic needs and stuff like that. But lastly, uncoverability. This is the best way. If people are beginning to feel that they own these resources, right? There's a high chance they're going to question more. They're going to make it more political. Hey, listen, you guys give us $20 million for resource rent of our entire beach. We can't fish there. We can't afford short. We can't afford water. Listen, you guys have to up it up. The reason why governments are unable to relate is because proximity, they are way far away from the suffering of the ordinary person down there. That is a significant delta also that CO and OO need to do it to prove why just because your government retains that particular fucking resource rate, somehow the miraculously are close to every single person. in every single particular family to know that you can't afford 3 square meal, stuff like that. Most government listen to those things, they think they are ridiculous, they think they are non-existent. As you can find ministers saying that everybody should afford 3 square meal in this area in Ghana, when the reality is not the case. 3 things that we establish from this particular debate, and these are super unique. They are not low-hanging. They are very, very important and impact a lot of families out there. 1, people being able to hedge faster against any harm that comes. It is only a side that uniquely does that will give you the power to be able to afford quality drinking water instead of drinking water that has cancerous elements. Secondly, we give you the ability to fix the power asymmetry between governments, multinational corporations, and the local person or man down there. Exclusively that happens, I said, because more money into your pocket, ability to call for more money and fight for more rent, resource rent. I don't know, listen, by opening government, so that's how you can give any little alleviation to the lives of people in these particular areas run by stupid corporations and stupid government and not government.
Thank you very much for that. The House now recognizes the DLO to close the opening half of the debate. Here. What are the social?
Social. Oh, there's social.
Hey!
Oh, there's social. Oh, there's social. When you are done, you lose.
No, you give us like 2 hours.
There's social. There's this a close ground.
No.
Don't let the devil use you.
I'm not the second.
Thank you.
Who is weak? Who is weak? One of them. It's a mystery. You like? Yeah, I'm sexy.
The story is not a big part, you are not getting anything.
When you are ready. So let's go. Panel, a couple of responses for some of the things that come from this side of the house. First of all, they tell you that they are either going to distribute the money to everybody in the country, or they are either going to use the money to the places where these resources are largely getting from, because they have the data and what's not and what's not. First of all, a couple of things why both worlds are extremely problematic. First thing, we think in a world where you only give the money to the people that exist in these particular spaces where the resources exist, you think you further entrench the inequality that you are trying to prevent, because the people, there are still more people in the country that won't end up getting that type of benefit, and they are going to be always complaining. And it also means that the other guys that live around these coastal areas are much fewer people, which means they're going to be getting far more money from these. They're going to be getting much more money from this whole resource rate thing, which means that essentially you're going to have the inequality that is so bad that it's going to be a extremely huge problem in your world. But secondly, if it is such a way that you share the resources across the entire country, we think that the average person will not be getting enough money to change their lives in a very important way, because we are talking about millions and millions of populations. If every month you have to give every individual in the country 500 Ghana cedis, we think that it will not change their life in a very drastic way for a couple of reasons. First of all, we think that it means that inflation is going to be is going to happen more, because everybody in the country gets a certain amount of money, which they are going to be using to be chasing the same amount of services. They'll be chasing the same water that they tell you about, the same ride-hailing systems and so on and so forth. That's allowed them to survive. We think that at the point where everybody has that resources, you need to be able to pay for it more, because you are competing for those limited resources that exist in your world. We think that's how inflation comes about. In a world where most people have plenty money and money is nothing, inflation becomes a huge problem. You are not able to use the money that you give them to do extremely important things. We think that is particularly problematic. But I'll take it later. But secondly, they tell you how the government is going to get money from the government is going to get money from taxation to do these industrial things and still cater for the large population. We don't think how that taxation money comes if the average person is going to be sitting somewhere in their house and they're going to be getting free money. We think reduce the incentive for people to work in the first place to be getting those taxation resources. But even and that is even if the money that we give them is significant for them to live on these type of things. But panel, if it is if like you buy into abroad, we think you still have the same issue. You still have to be working, you still have to pay taxes because that money is not enough, and like you still have to go to work, and you don't really change like the lives of these individuals. We don't think you get a lot of change from their side of the world. But secondly, remember that sad story tells you about the poor boy that's not going to get water, and now he has like the means to get water and so on and so forth. We think that like most of these things happen in places where the environment is like extremely deteriorated. So places like Ghana, where Ghana is one of the biggest issues, and the quality of water is drastically reducing. And like predictions are saying that by 2030 you're not going to be getting water, and that's extremely bad, and like the whole country is going to die. We think that Kofi is not going to be getting quality water because the environment is going to like significantly worse, and the money that is going to get will be less valuable because of the information as well that I tell you about. We don't think you really change a lot of things on that side of the house. Panel, why do we ultimately win today's debate? But before then, I'll take the keyword.
Okay, firstly, it's ridiculous to say people will stop or leave their job just because you're giving them money. They live in a capitalist society that demands that they have the financial capacity to afford this. And then secondly, inequality only exists when you can't afford these services within your location. It is wrong for you to assume that just because that money goes in, those things will just
Out of order.
afford basic things.
Like the simple thing I tell you in inflation, if you give everybody money and they have to be chasing the same limited resources, we think that people will need more money to be able to buy those things. So you don't really change it. You don't really change the narrative because everybody has that base amount of money. It becomes extremely insignificant. You just make prices more like far more expensive, and we think that these things are extremely horrible. But panel, we think it's also important to understand that in these type of places, like these governments rely on these type of resources for a couple of things. We think that at the, when they because they are largely exporting their national resources and their resources that are extremely valuable on a large scale, we think multiple global actors are looking for their currency to be able to purchase these type of things. We think this ultimately leads to their currency appreciating the value and ultimately leads to their currency appreciating in value. Panel, we think this causes a couple of things. It means that the things that they produce, their industry that's supposed to diversify their income, is something that they simply can't compete as much on the global scale because their things are going to, their products are going to be more expensive, and they don't have like any other alternative than to rely on these resources. We think these things are bad for a couple of reasons. Because Daniel tells you that we live in a world where you don't know when the next big thing is going to happen. We think if we face crisis like COVID-19 or like extremely bad like crisis, you need the money in your reserves. You need a buffer to cushion yourself to be able to alleviate yourself from that economic crisis. At the point where you share the money to everybody and even like reap anybody the benefits, like you think that the entire economy is going to crash. Also, in that point in time, when you can't provide these rents to these individuals, you think their lives will be far worse because now there's like completely nothing they can do. Their bank accounts are down to zero. Panel, what then do we tell you? We tell you that the governments have like the largest incentive to ensure that there's development, like there's growth, there's industrialization. We think it's also very important that the only way that governments can finally diversify their resources is if they are able to find alternative ways to make their things cheaper. So if they can put their money into research and design and so on and so forth to find supply chain inefficiencies, they are more likely going to put in a place where they can export resources at a completely competitive price. We think at the point where the government doesn't have the capacity to do these type of things, they are stuck in a position where they have to rely on the resources forever and ever until the biggest crisis knocks them out. Panel, and the other thing that Daniel tells you is how environmental degradation is a really huge issue. First of all, we think in places like Ghana and Nigeria, because of the massive dependence on these type of things, the environment are largely deteriorated. We think you further worsen the issue when you are giving reparations, when you are giving like rents based on the resources that you export. It means that if citizens are able to find a way to export more resources, they are going to get higher rents because they are ultimately going to need those higher rents, because what I tell you like earlier in the debate. We think at the point where that particular thing happens, and at the point where like they need those rents, they are going to put more of their resources into exploiting the environment in ways that will be hard to regulate. They are going to like try to export, do like the most harmful things, like mine with mercury, deteriorate water bodies, because you know that ultimately it's going to give them those type of financial resources. Ultimately, these individuals also don't have like a large incentive or a large ability to fix the environment because these things cost a lot of money. We think the only actor that has the capacity and the resources to be able to care these environmental things are the government, and these governments are pouring all those resources away in an environment where they don't really have. Like they don't get the resources from anywhere else. You think their world is going bad, you think the poor boy will never get water, and you think we're going to this place. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. That brings us to the end of the opening house. invite you. I can invite you.
Oh, for real?
I'm not inviting them.
I don't have anything to say, so I'm happy to go on. Alright. Are we good? Thank you. Opening opposition needs some consistency because one, they tell us that these resources are finite, so sharing it is problematic. But then they go on to tell us that government is going to use the same resources to not just develop the communities that are affected, but to also use it to strengthen the economy through federal reserves and all of those kinds of things. The money is it Schrodinger's cash here? Like it's too big here, it's too small here, let's be serious. I'm going to do three things in this speech. The first is I'm going to prove to you why in principle this is the only thing that makes sense. And I'm going to do a pragmatic argumentation as to how this money is best utilized in our world. And finally, I'm going to tell you how government not even having access to resource rent is net positive for society. First, argumentation of proximity to harm. We think that the people who bear the cost of extraction are almost never the political elites or members of government. It means that these are fishing communities that are close to these offshore drilling. It's villagers who have been displaced by mining. It's farmers whose lands have been polluted. And it means that what we're saying generally is that the harms that come from all of these things are super localized. It means it's oil spills, it's polluted rivers, it's rising cost of living, and all of these things are personalized. It means that the people who live near these extraction sites experience these harms very immediately and personally. When they tell you that the government is going to use the money that is supposed to be used to solve their problems that they are expressing in real time, to protect the results of some future like COVID-19 or whatever, it means that they agree that government is always never proactive to immediately solve the problems when they experience them. But more importantly, because of the nature of these harms, they express unequally. It means that people who live in urban places may see things like higher GDP, like weaker reserves or whatever, but the people who are in these communities and who are proximate are going to have poisoned water, lost income and those kinds of things. Let's tell you why when government retains it, it is bad even when the government is not corrupt and perfect. The two problems here are first. We think that because even competent government are structurally bad at responding to individualized suffering, because we explained to you in the past argument that the suffering that they experience is unique to each and every one of them. It means that government is always going to want to intervene in ways that are generalized. They're going to build highways, they're going to build bridges, airports, universities, maybe give out a handful of scholarships. It means that these are things that may improve general national indexes, but they're never going to directly target the locals who have been immediately impacted uniquely. This is why it is important, because in the opening half, there's this debate around whether the money should be for the people who are in these local communities or whether they are for the nation. We think that by virtue of the fact that there is a hierarchy of the harms that are experienced, that the people who experience the most harm are entitled to the most allocation in terms of these resources. But then we think that citizens are best able to solve all of the problems that are described for multiple reasons. No, shut up. Two reasons. First, we think that government is unable to perfectly calculate the needs of millions of individuals who have unique living conditions. It means that people are going to need different things: consumption support, debt relief, medical treatment, and all of those kinds of things. It means that our world allows these individuals to solve the immediate problems that they have in real time. Understand there is an urgency to solve these problems, because when you don't solve them, they self-propagate. It means that today I'm just inhaling soot, but tomorrow I have lung problems and all of those kinds of things. It means that urgency is best solved in our world when these individuals get access to this money. On large-scale infrastructure and inability for these citizens to build things like roads and those kinds of things, to think that in our world there is still the possibility that these are things that people will need. I think that we prefer a world where people within these communities collectivize and say that of this money we've received, we want to come together as a community to solve the problem of road or access to A, B, or C. We think that this is more effective for two reasons. First, that government is fucking big and slow. What this means is that they're never able to immediately intervene when they need it, but more importantly, they usually intervene based on what they think are general indexes for what people need. In our world, these communities are immediately able to say that this is what we need most, that what we need is not a road, for example, what we need is a well for water, and they're immediately able to intervene in real time. But more importantly, if you don't buy everything I've said, you have to buy this argument on legitimacy. I think that when citizens see corporations extracting wealth around them, and they see their government collecting revenue, they begin to assume, that the state and the extraction economy are illegitimate. What usually happens in the Niger Delta in Nigeria is that we now begin to see things like pipeline vandalism, we see attacks on extraction infrastructure, we see kidnappings and those kinds of things. It means that it currently immediately leads, if we don't immediately show immediate impact
to intervene and relieve them, it translates into violence, it translates into destruction of the extraction economies that for which they are supposed to prop up. This is how we strengthen the social contract. I think that states become better governments when they depend on citizens for revenue. When we have resource rent, we sever this dependency. It means that taxation creates a reciprocal accountability. We prefer a world where we give them this money and then they go on to pay some portion of it as taxes. Why is this important? Because historically, states become accountable because they needed citizens to work, to trade, in order to produce taxable wealth for them. In that world, it forced governments to protect property rights, to improve their institutions, to negotiate politically. The problem is that when we have resource rents, we bypass this entire social contract for where government needs the citizens to be productive to produce rent. The government cannot directly rely on just these resources. The result of that, it breaks the social contract. The second problem is that resource-funded states optimize for extraction but not human capital. It means that when they get this revenue easily from natural resources, they are going to prioritize things like maintaining the extraction capacity. It means that their political focus is going to shift towards commodity management. Long-term investment in citizen productivity is no longer going to be as important. We think that in our world, when citizens directly receive this rent, it means that household wealth becomes the engine of growth for the state. What this means is that government must now cultivate more ways to keep them productive with the funds that they have, as they're going to be able to generate taxable revenue that is able to solve the problems that they ultimately have. But more importantly, we think that direct distribution is going to prevent the political denomination by removing the control that state has over survival. What this means is that the person who controls economic survival controls political behavior. In the world where government retains it, that can choose for fuck's sake whatever it is they want to do with it, it means that citizens, political actors, and everybody have to depend on and be subservient to the government in order for them to be able to get any forms of meaningful relief. It's why there are certain parts of the country where they are even like impacted by oil spills and stuff like that. They don't get anything probably because they didn't vote for the government of the day or stuff like that. In our world, we immediately return control and give and decentralize the power that states hold by virtue of resources that they do not immediately, have any sort of legitimate ownership over. At the end of the day, this debate is not about whether it is good for this money to come back to the citizens. I think that everybody agrees. The question is, should it come back by government deciding what to do with it, or should it come back directly to the citizens? I think that our world is better because at the end of the day, the productivity that is catalyzed by what we do in our world ultimately leads to growth and progress. At the end of the day, that trickles down in terms of tax income back to the government. Proud to govern.
Thank you very much for that number of comments. The House now witnessed them move on to position. To begin with the Kyeremeh. So why did you tell me the social
It's following here.
Is this the last one?
Yeah.
This is the last one.
Logo, let's go.
Is it Dorvlo or Lovro?
Eh?
Is it Dorvlo or Lovro?
Is it Dorvlo?
I mean, you're mentioning two debaters in me to ask me. No. You said Lovro, do I hear?
No, Logo.
That no, you don't get it. It's fine.
Please introduce yourself, second.
No, I'm Dorvlo.
Dorvlo, okay.
It's done. It's not important.
Let's go.
So, starting in 3, 2, 1, my debate will be centered around the mistakes that every other team makes in today's debate. Let's start with opening government. Opening government heart is in the right place. Their solution is just not what the debate is about. They say 3 things. 1, they talk about private companies. They talk about how private companies come to do things like oil spillage, how these people take all the money, and they have the impact of capital flight. The problem is, I asked Furgurson, how does private companies play into this debate? Because at the point where governments are not the ones that drill or extract resources. So for example, in Ghana, most resources in Ghana are mined by Anglo-Gold Ashanti, which is a South African company. Most like oil is drilled in Nigeria by a Dutch company called Shell, and in several parts of Africa, we have Saudi Aramco that drills because governments don't want to invest into mining companies, which means that on each side of the world, the mining companies are still going to work. The solution then to stop that from happening is not you changing the methods through which you pay people, it's you actually clamping down on the bad mining practices and the ways in which they spill oil, proactive things like sending people on ground to deal with them. Even if you pay people differently, you don't solve the problem. I genuinely don't know what you're doing. The second issue they talk about is that they have a problem with redistribution. And this is the arguments they make. That there's things like corruption, and then there's things like corruption that exists, and because of that, and they also like to give money to people who vote for them. The problem I equally have with this is that this might be true, but the problem with corruption is not transferring cash with hand. The problem is like giving cash with hand to people is the worst thing that happens, because this can literally include ghost names. You know it everywhere in schemes like the National Service in Ghana, where they have so many ghost names. It's easy to create human beings or pay people who are already dead and take those things and now spend time solving that problem or even washing the books. I really don't get how paying people differently solve the issue. But then let's come to closing. I think closing's biggest argument is this, is that people who are closer to this thing deserve like more money because they suffer. I am actually not going to strongman this. I'll still man the argument for you. And this I'll still man this argument. The issue is true. Carcinogenic materials are released when you are near places where they drill, they use mercury, etc. Your children are bound to suffer. It is equally true that things like soup will probably enter your respiratory system, you probably die, your life expectancy probably goes low. The problem, the solution, however, is not giving money to these people directly. Do you know why that is not good? 5 reasons why this is a bad idea. 1, we are not sure that people are specifically going to spend that money on the problems that affect them, while individuals have priorities of need that they are able to do. So if what he wants, his impact, is to solve that problem, he needs to assume the human preference system of all those people and show us why they are likely to spend that on solving the health problem and not taking it to take their partners out to go and have a drink. But let's assume they actually do solve the health problem. And I'm still helping the argument but still breaking it down. The issue is it becomes a cyclical thing. They destroy the environment, we pay you, you get unhealthy, we come back and then they destroy the environment again and nothing happens. Once again, you see that the problems are real, paying people through different ways does not solve the way that they spill the oil, does not solve the problems that come with them. Which means the answer to these people is not giving money to people differently. The answer is actually making sure the laws work, is making sure we engage in proactive ways. For example, the Norwegian Oil and the Wealth Fund, the way they do is that they have engineers and people on ground in the mining processes, making sure that they do not let greed bypass the the accountability they have to people in the future, etc. I'll take you along the line, right? Then first thing we need to talk about in today's debate is the reality for most countries. And now let's come to these people and how it is in today's debate. For most countries, the ways they take like monies and solve their and run their states by a lot of ways. It's either through the taxes they get, the loans they take, the resources that they have, which we are talking about today, or the investments they make. Why do we think that by paying out cash to the people and government not pulling that resource together even harms all other ways of making cash? Because Ferguson actually tells you that you can still take salary from people, you can still take loans. So maybe even if this one goes back, you don't care. We'll show you why you should care. The first thing is that the loans, for most global countries, just like everybody rightfully says, they are poor, hospitals are bad, roads are not good. The problem, however, is that if you want to take loans to solve those problems, most at times you need collaterals. So you hear that they are using the bauxite mines in Takrady to back Chinese taking loans in Ghana. They are using the gold mines in Kwasi to take IMF loans to Ghana. The problem, however, is that if you take those resource places, sequester them, and put them in a method that it's a monthly payout for those citizens, you cannot use that then to use as a collateral for the loans you get. But at the point where you are equally not getting loans, but people are expecting a lot of things from you, you have to increase taxes. The problem that gives is that you are hustling backwards. You are giving people money, but you're simply to take it back more from them, because the way government needs to enter high investment things are things that go down to a huge extent. Opening.
Nothing stops us in this debate from fixing bad mining regulation. That can exist on both sides. They have refused to respond to the fact that people in society do not directly benefit from the resource revenues that most governments
okay. So if that's the truth, then that's an issue of corruption. And if people are being corrupt, you don't take the physical cash and hand it over to them. That does not solve the structural issue, just that changes the payment method. It's like, are you going to use cash to pay, or are you going to use another method to pay? That does not solve the corruption within the government. That changes the way in which you pay the people. This is still logical. Like, honestly, it's a very lofty idea to think that giving people cash instead of making roads are actually going to solve the problem. The first problem with this thing is the problem of spreading resources thing. Why is this very important? And why Ferguson's argument? Ferguson is the reason we win. Ferguson says when you invite the Dutch companies to come and mine on the seas, and they bring their personnel, their engineers, their equipment, etc., they are probably just going to give you 20% of money that comes out. 20% when Ghana has 300 million every quarter of the year looks a lot. But when Nigeria has to pay 300 million across 400 million people in the country, it means nothing. What does that mean then in that regard? The ability to pull resources together and make structural investments that advance people in the long term. For example, creation of industries to employ thousands of people is going to be less likely than giving somebody 50 cedis every month for them to depend on etc. But the second problem is that the problems in most developing countries are issues of structure and not issues of personal things. So maybe you have money and you can actually fly passing air from Accra to Kumasi, but the problem is passing air is fucking inefficient, which means you probably have the money, but you cannot pull it together to create new businesses and services that actually help the people, which means that you probably get that money, you are a millionaire, but you are still suffering in a system where structures are non-existent or they do not work then in that regard. Redistribution is the worst thing. It's even evil in their side. Because now you are looking at geographically. If you live in an area where those resources are not there, those things you are living in various places, you probably get nothing then in that regard. And governments cannot do things like get fund, things like subsidized electricity, reduce tariffs, etc. for a help. Proud to propose.
Yeah.
Alright, thank you very much for that speech. The House recognizes the government group to end the government speech. Here.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
Look how man. Just do the brief stuff. Okay. Alright, so.
The camera.
Okay.
Do you want to record your entire speech? Do you want to just talk about it?
I would have put it like my
Don't worry.
Oh, okay.
Are you? Alright. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. There are quite a couple of things that Raymond tells you that we get no response from. The first thing he tells you is how the people who are majorly affected by this crisis or by this resource extraction rarely get any single benefit. And this is what it looks like. The people in Ashanti region and Western region are the ones who suffer galamsey and the effect of illegal mining. But when government gets these resources, what do? They allocate most of this to places like Accra and Kumasi. You cannot tell me that Western regions and Ashanti gets the same amount of allocation as Accra does. So what exactly does that create? A world of unequal allocations, right? Because some people suffer the effect of this resource extraction while others enjoy that. Our world is one which necessarily breaks this down and then just show that in as much as Accra is getting their allocations, these people who suffer these things still get an amount of benefit. And that is why it tells you, because even when it's assume a best case scenario where the government is infinitely good, we still say the government thinks about the big things, right? So they think about, okay, how exactly can everybody enjoy? Let's build airports so you don't have to take 6 hours to drive from Accra to Kumasi. Let's build bridges so you're not having accidents on the road. But recognize that these things do not solve the problem of each and every single person that faces these things. We say that when you give them money, is a world in which you're able to have them live better. And this tackles the argument this guy says, because this guy wants to argue some nonsense about how they're going to spend it on nonsense. Recognize there are no Dior stores or IM stores in places like the Western region or in places like Niger Delta, like the Niger Delta in Nigeria. What you mostly have are people whose travel budgets will be able to afford the basics. So it means that when they get this money, they are less likely going to spend it on frivolities. because these are villagers who do not even know what the good life looks like. They are more likely going to spend it on their basic needs. But secondly, these people are local communities who have lived together for most of their life. What usually happens in places like that is they are better able to coagulate to provide things for themselves. If you go to places like the Western region and Niger Delta in Nigeria, you would realize that majority of the times they provide their own social amenities by themselves. It looks like they are the ones who provide their own security. They think they are well because government refuses to give them water. These are people who, even without government help, already have a long-standing tradition of trying to provide things for themselves and coming together as a community to improve their quality of life. We then say, at the point in which you begin to give them cash payments, they are less likely going to spend it on frivolity like this guy said, but rather necessarily spend it on waste necessarily make things better for themselves. But the second thing that Raymond tells you and why we need these guys is how resourcement weaken the social contract. And this is the panel. I want you to ask yourself how many different ways governments can make money in Ghana. I'm pretty sure it's more than just gold, right? Your agricultural sector can be better, yes or no? Your educational sector can be better. Your tech talents can be more developed. In Nigeria, right, it's not just only oil that can make money for us. Several other things can make money. So ask yourself, why is the government not doing that? The reason why the government doesn't really care is because they know they will get money from oil. They know that they're going to get money from gold. What that creates is a world whereby governments are already necessarily lax, right? Because they know that there's a bank of money they have. In a world where you take that source of income from the government, what is the government forced to do? They are forced to look for other ways to simply get money. And the other ways they can get money looks like things like taxes. But recognize, unlike the way this guy says, where they will say, oh, government will just increase taxes, we think government is rather going to necessarily want to push for more economic output. Because recognize, the more income you have and the more companies you have, the more taxes people pay. So we say, in our world where governments can no longer rely on things like resourcement, they are forced to necessarily look at other forms of economic activities that can necessarily give them money. What that looks like is you're going to break the chain of economic dependence on only resources and have a nation that necessarily tries to, as much as possible, develop other sectors and not necessarily develop. You can come and pick up family. Oh.
You already analyzed why if you export to agri sector, nobody's going to buy it because things are become more expensive. But also we don't know that is making money for healthcare, education, because to provide those services.
Oh please. I mean like panel. So the only good thing that comes from these guys is they want to talk about how things are going to be infinitely more expensive. We don't think that giving money to the little population you have in Niger Delta or the little population you have in the Western region is going to so badly influence the economy to a point where things are going to become more expensive. We think that these individuals are more likely going to put it into things like their social amenities or even things like scaling their own business. Because recognize, we characterize to you guys that these are farmers, right? These are local fishermen, people who would rather put their money into their business. They're not people who are going there and by spending money on pizza. That is even if a pizza store even exists in places like that. The fourth thing we tell you that they do not engage is on how you delegitimize the state and these people. And that's why you have violent eruptions. It's why you have illegal mining in Ghana. Because they know the reason why these people go out and mine illegally, even though it's dangerous, is because they know that the companies who are doing it, it doesn't trickle back to them. The reason why we have Niger Delta militants, right, and why we have so much vandalization is because those people feel neglected by the government. But in the point where you begin to reward them, we think that these people are less likely going to necessarily be involved themselves in this kind of things. Why is it going to be better? Recognize that almost 40% of Ghana's gold falls through illegal mining, which means that this so-called revenue they're shouting, the government doesn't even get the most out of it, right? Because since these are mining illegally, the amount of pipeline vandalization being done in Nigeria simply means that we're losing so much oil. But the point in time we begin to compensate these individuals, they have zero incentive to begin to necessarily vandalize or go through with illegal mining. You saw majority of the problems we begin to experience within that particular point. I'm not talking about okay,
yes, the issue is not that we are not compensating them. We are equally compensating them by building roads for etc. But the problem is,
look, panel. And this is the problem, right? And they're basically supporting our case because we tell you that government looks on a globe, like on a total outlook, right? So, for example, there is no use of roads, right, for somebody whose water is dirty. There is no use of roads for a child that is inhaling soot, right? Even if what is you can mind you, like I said, government also have priorities. There is no matter how benevolent a government is, they would never be able to prioritize Ashanti as they prioritize Accra. They definitely have to do that. So we still don't think that even if government wants to be so good, these people are still going to suffer at the end of the day. The other thing these guys tell you that is quite funny is that people would not work, right, and government will suffer. Two things. We think that even if these people do not work and all they do is spend money, government still earn because of course the more you buy, like when you buy things you pay back, so that's the first thing. But second thing is the more purchasing power people have, the more revenue companies earn, right? Because people buy more of their products, which means that the more revenue they have, the more money they pay in corporate taxes to the government, right? But thirdly, we don't think that the idea of people not working is going to make sense because like people have worked all their life. I see no reason why in a capitalistic world that tends to evolve, they will simply just sit down and not work. What exactly do we prove today, and why do we necessarily win this debate? We prove to all of these guys that try to stay on both sides of the line. We tell you we stand fully for the individuals who are approximate to this harm. They deserve to be compensated. That's the first thing we tell you. And we show you how these people are better able to handle their needs because they can collaborate as a community and solve their problems. The second thing we tell you is how government is going to be forced to look for other means of revenue. And the reason why that is good is because you're going to have an expansive economy and not just an economy that is dependent on resources. The third thing we tell you is that in their own world, right, there is going to be a legitimizing of government and this, which is why you're going to have things like violent activity, right? And the fourth thing we necessarily tell you is that these people are individuals who suffer these harms. They deserve to be compensated. You are proud to govern.
Thank you. Alright, thank you very much for that speech. The House recognizes the Chief Whip to end the debate. Here. Hey.
Hey, calm down.
I'm sure this is not going on.
You can't set the camera. How would you set it? Connect speaker points from you.
Yeah, so
Hey,
it's from your neck.
I underestimated my height.
What phone is that?
Oppo. Those Chinese people.
No, she's asked her so that she never buys it.
Let's start with closing government's undefended principle. The first principle we get from them is about the idea of proximity. We see the people that are close to the issue should be the ones that get access to compensation. The first problem is that this principle is inconsistent with the motion, because the motion does not assume that you are giving money directly to only those affected. It assumes you are giving money directly to every other civil citizen. What that essentially means is that their principle should be able to cater for the other individuals that are equally not proximately affected by the issue. So people who don't live in Galamsey sites, people who are never affected by dirty drinking water, all of those other majority of individuals that exist in society, their principle has to be consistent with all of those individuals. It means at best their case only answers a few amount of individuals, and it's not that something that has not cut across the entire debate.
The second problem then is that if it can work specifically that way, then it means that the way in which this policy is most likely going to be enacted is that we only give money to those specific individuals that are proximate to those specific things. The problem with this is that this principle also is inherently discriminatory to all the other individuals who should get access to a share of the national resources, because it's not just about specific groups of individuals, but it's about the entire nation and how these people are affected in that regard. The third problem then is that the current status quo does not account for a vast majority of individuals because of the idea that governments do not actually build roads because they siphon the money, they are corrupt. But that is non-comparative, because governments can equally be corrupt in their word, and the way in which to manifest that you would wait for like 3 years and the direct cash has not come. What that essentially means that the inefficiency that comes with the government is something that can equally exist in their words, meaning that the extent to which they then say that that specific benefit is exclusive, not exclusive to their side, because the governments are corrupt, the governments are inefficient, they'll be corrupt, they'll be inefficient, that people do not actually get access to the direct cash, meaning that the extent to which they can be able to get access to all of the impact that is built off of the back of getting the direct cash is something that is not existent. But the second part of their case is, the second part of their case is that people are more likely to solve problems that are proximate to them, and the government cannot solve those proximate problems to them. Here's the truth of the matter. A lot of the most proximate things to you as a citizen are things you actually cannot solve. Very proximate things to you, like access to electricity. Unless they can explain how people can build their own dams and generate their own electricity, these are things that are proximate to you, but you actually cannot solve. And that's the reason why the institution of the government exists, to solve the most basic things that are very important for you. So even certain things like dirty water, when the government does not clean the water, you will not get access to get clean water. Because the comparative is not that you go and buy the water, you go and buy the clean water from where, if all the waters are dirty. It means that the government actually have to solve the problem. And I can go on and on and on. Hospital, your health, very approximate to you. It is very important then that the government is the one that steps in to solve these problems, because these problems need massive scale of resources to be able to solve. If you fine-tune the money to specific individuals, because a person cannot build a hospital, because a person cannot like mechanically clean their own water, they cannot actually be able to solve the problems for them. But equally, government creates the frameworks that allow for individuals to solve their own personal problems. It looks like certain things like creation of employment. And the way the government does this is by inputting money. But you can't input the money if you don't get the money from these resources, because you are giving the money directly to these specific individuals. So people will have access to money, but at the end of the day, they will not be able to use the money for anything. They will actually not be able to solve any of their problems. And just the response they have for it. Literally, this is what she says. These other things are dumb. Explain to me how a person's health is dumb. Access to electricity is dumb. The most basic things that are needed by the government to be able to actually intervene, because you don't have the capacity to be able to solve it, are certain things that are dumb. Once they then move on to their next claim is that, well, you have to create a wealth of household and be able to maintain that wealth of household. First of all, there is no wealth of household that is created in the first place. Because one, you don't just out of the blue become an entrepreneur if there are not entrepreneurial structures in the country that can be able to facilitate those things. So certain things like giving of subsidies to individuals. You can't just stand up and like make business with like small money. Especially when something goes unresponded. Because Dorvlo explains like the money is big, but when you spread the money across individuals over a year, it significantly decreases. This is exclusive to our side. It means that even the money cannot be able to do a lot of substantial things. So you need to be able to create the frameworks that allow for individuals to live autonomously, or individuals to be able to fight for the proximate things. But they don't get that if the entire system is shit. The response cannot then be corruption, because I've explained to you this corruption and inefficiency equally exist on your side. It means that there's no delta in the debate in that regard. But before I move on to any other thing, I'll take for you.
Government's responsibility to constitutionally provide for people is not taken away from its political. How do you give hospitals and electricity for people that cannot afford those things?
Fair. It makes sense. Against these guys, not to us. This is the reason why. First of all, Daniel's speech says that people do not have governments do not have the capacity to invest in other segments, and this is their only main way of getting access to resources. Ferguson literally agrees. Ferguson literally says there are other alternatives that exist. He then had the burden to explain why this is the only source of revenue, or this is the main source of revenue for government. The way Dorvlo explains that particular part is by analyzing to you what the comparatives or what the realistic alternatives are, and why those realistic alternatives are actually not good. One, the alternative is taxes, which means that you have to increase taxes of individuals. This is exactly why his household wealth income thing does not make sense. Because people actually do not have spending power. They have money, but they don't have spending power because taxes are on the high. It means that the extent to which you are able to work and get access to money to be able to use for other things is something that is significantly low. But I think the second thing, or the second problem, is that they then say that, well, other sources of investments can be looked for, and we can build economic capacity. how will you plug the money from the air and use to build economic capacity? Because building economic capacity requires money. Building economic capacity means that you are able to create certain things like structures for unemployment and all of those things. But you don't have access to But you don't have access to these specific resources because you usually rely on these things in that. I'm not taking anyone else. You usually rely on these things in that regard. They have to prove to us why the alternative is able to make sure that you solve all of the most important problems. If their case is about proximity, we explain why the most proximate things to you is things that only the government has the capacity to be able to do in that regard. Opening government and why there's a problem with their speech. First thing they say is that there is a middleman in our world, there's no middleman in their world. No, there's equally a middleman in their world. Tinubu will not come and give you the cash directly. He has to equally use the governmental agencies. If the governmental agencies are ineffective on our side, they are equally ineffective on your side. So in all of that ineffectiveness, we prefer that at least it benefits the majority of individuals. Second thing they then say is that discrimination means that certain people are isolated, but discrimination equally exists on their world. But the reason ours is better is because if discrimination means that you are only developing Kumasi, at least you can move from Accra and go to Kumasi and enjoy all of the benefits. But if the cash is direct and it is still discriminatory, you can't go and enter somebody's pocket and remove the cash to be able to use it for yourself as an individual. So even in our discrimination, it is much more accessible, it is not more perpetual for a lot of individuals because something that is long lasting and something that's not easy in that regard. And the big problem with their words is that they don't respond to a lot of the cases. They only call the cases down and they only enforce the cases. A bulk of analysis that explains why the alternatives are significantly worse for a vast majority of individuals, and we explain to you why tax increase of taxes or loans, which are very pernicious because it puts the country in debt, and then all of the economic crisis that they are talking about is something that can actually happen. For all of these reasons, we are proud to be closing. We see at the end of the show.
Thank you guys so much. Please do the panels.